Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday series on Zoom. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are honored to host a brilliant scholar and activist who has written one of the most important books dealing with the climate crisis, and that is Aviva Chomsky. Her book is Science Enough? 40 Questions About Climate Justice, which I'm highly recommending, and hopefully every environmentalist will read this book. It's extraordinary. So this examines the big picture in dealing with the challenges that we face in solving the climate crisis. Aviva Chomsky is a professor of history and Latin American studies at Salem State University in Massachusetts. And she was a research associate at Harvard, where she specialized in Caribbean and Latin American history. She worked with the United Farm Workers Union and has been involved in labor organizing. Her book, West Indian Workers and the United Fruit Company in Costa Rica, 1870 to 1940, was awarded the 1997 Best Book Prize by the New England Council of Latin American Studies. Chomsky holds a PhD in history from UC Berkeley, and today we're going to talk about, is science enough? So welcome, Aviva. It's wonderful to have you with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, we're very happy to have you, and there'll be other people who will be seeing this video later. So I want to begin the interview today with a quote from you, because I think it will set the stage for what I hope will happen with people's thinking during the meeting and afterwards. And this is what you wrote in the book. The way that we identify causes will determine the way we conceptualize what needs to change. I found that quite profound, because it's basically saying what we bring to the problem is only what we're going to see and nothing beyond that. So I just want to repeat that before I ask the first question. The way we identify the causes will determine the way we conceptualize what needs to change. So your book begins, actually your title begins with the question, is science enough? And you write about the problem with techno-optimists and how their thinking is not only wrong, but actually dangerous. So I'd like you to talk first about some of these problematic techno fixes that were being sold or that are being foisted upon us today.
Sure. Let me just say something about that quote, because I've been thinking about it, not the quote itself, but the concept so much, in just thinking about our local congressional representative, Seth Moulton, here in whatever district we are in Massachusetts, who we have been arguing with since October 7th, basically, about what's going on in Gaza. And Seth Moulton is a military man. He's a man with a military background. He's served 4 tours in Iraq. And he thinks everything has a military solution. So when we go to talk to him, all he wants to talk about is tactical questions, like taking for granted that we're starting with a military solution to every problem. And it's impossible to get beyond his kind of narrow-mindedness. And I've just been thinking about the kind of old saying about how if the tool you have in your hand is a hammer, everything you see looks like a nail. And I think I kind of had that same concept in mind when I was writing this book about climate change, that if we take for granted a certain set of ideas about what the causes of climate change are, then from that flow particular types of solutions. So, but I often feel like we forget to ask, well, what are the causes of the causes? And just one other example where I think about that a lot is our current president, Joe Biden, when he was campaigning and early in his presidency, was talking about migration. And he said he was going to get to the roots of migration, which he said were poverty, corruption, and violence. But he forgot to ask, what are the roots of the roots? So there are reasons for poverty, corruption, and violence too. And if you only look at the surface level, you're not really going to be able to change poverty, corruption, and violence unless you ask, well, what are the roots of poverty, corruption, and violence? Exactly. So yeah, I think there's a continuity in my thinking on that. But when we're talking about the climate and techno-optimism and techno-fixes, like clearly the immediate cause of climate change is greenhouse gas emissions. Primarily CO2, but also some other greenhouse gas emissions that are actually much more potent than CO2, but that are released in smaller quantities. So often we measure greenhouse gas emissions in what we call CO2 equivalents, how much CO2 equivalents, including things like methane and nitrous oxide and other chlorofluorocarbons that are going into the atmosphere, if we were to use the CO2 measurement as the translate everything into. So CO2 equivalent emissions is the cause of our climate crisis. But what is the cause? So if we look only at CO2 emissions, then we can say, okay, so we can take the CO2 out of the air and then we've solved the problem. But if we don't ask what are the causes of the CO2 emissions, and why is it, for example, that some places like the United States have such an outsized CO2 per capita, that is, for our population, how much CO2 we're emitting, and so many other aspects of our global economic and social and political system that have contributed to the climate crisis. And the other piece of this is that we can't really look at CO2 emissions in isolation, because in some ways CO2 emissions are just a symptom of all of these other ways that we are putting pressure on our natural environment. One group of social scientists has put together a list of 9 planetary boundaries that we are exceeding. CO2 emissions, atmospheric CO2 being only one of 9 planetary boundaries, because all of our production and consumption does more than just emit CO2. It also contributes to toxic waste. It contributes to ocean acidification. It contributes to loss of biodiversity. So that if we look narrowly just at CO2, we're kind of missing the big picture, and we're also missing the social and economic causes of the interlocking multiple environmental crises that we are causing for ourselves and other living species on the planet. So simply creating more technologies that are and this is the techno-optimism, the idea that with our ingenuity, we can create more technologies that can undo all of the damage that we've done. Pretty much every technology runs on energy. So we have to talk about where is that energy going to come from. And every form of energy production, including what we call clean energy, that is clean energy, which doesn't really have a very clear definition. But if you're talking just in terms of CO2 emissions, clean energy would include things like nuclear and hydroelectric and wind and solar. All of those forms of energy production have other environmental impacts, even if they aren't causing CO2 emissions. So there's going to be an environmental cost to the production of energy, no matter how we produce it. Just think about hydroelectric, and I should say environmental and social cost. And in a way, I can't even separate the environmental from the social costs. So say hydroelectric, the dams that displace, in some cases, thousands and thousands of people, that destroy agricultural land, that dramatically affect wildlife. Every hydroelectric project has human and environmental and non-human life victims. Nuclear energy may be a really important part of our fight against CO2 emissions, but nuclear energy also has severe environmental costs that we don't know how to deal with. We have no way of dealing with nuclear waste. And then there's the techno-optimism. Well, sometime in the future, we'll figure out a way. But my main point is that the technological solutions all rely on increasing production of energy. And we look at what's happening in the United States right now. like the pressure on our electrical grid and the expectation of how much electricity we're going to have to produce if we are electrifying everything, which is the current techno-optimist mantra. We do have to electrify everything. But if we do not reduce our use of energy, we are going to cause such drastic environmental destruction through producing the amount of electricity we would need to use to not only replace the fossil fuel sources of electricity production that we're using now, but increase our use of electricity as we increase our population and we increase our use of technology, that we really have to look at the bigger picture of the differing environmental costs. So addressing the climate emergency through addressing CO2 and CO2 equivalent emissions is absolutely essential, but not by causing all kinds of other problems.
Right. I want to stay, I have so many questions I could ask you, but I know people on the call are going to want to ask too later. But I wanted to stay with this just for a moment more, because some of the cheerleaders for this techno-optimist movement they have giant pulpits from which to preach. And this affects a lot of people's thinking. And you pointed them out in your book, like Bill Gates, Nicholas Kristof, Steven Pinker, who have these kind of rose-colored glasses on about how technology will solve our climate problems. And I think many people are influenced by them. So I'm interested in how you would see countering or dissecting this thinking in a way that can get past their influence on the culture, basically.
Well, of course, major corporate America and some of its cheerleaders, like some of the people you just named, are completely bought into the technological solution, because what it basically is doing, as in Biden's infrastructure plan, is transferring a lot of public money to the private sector. So it's immensely profitable to corporate America to have the population buy into the idea that the solution to climate change is for the government to give more money to corporations, basically.
Right.
So that they can produce more, so that they can pollute more. But also so that the US population can consume more. One other piece of this puzzle that I think we have to look at, and that I think is also an important component of helping people to understand why we need to challenge this sort of utopian corporate mindset, is global economic inequality. And I argue in the book that global economic inequality is reflected in emissions inequality. So basically, the richer you are, the more you produce and consume, the more emissions you have. And there are large portions of the planet's population that live in energy poverty. That is, they don't have access to enough energy to meet basic human needs, things like clean water, basic primary health care, enough food. So part of the techno-optimist idea is that we're going to maintain current levels of global economic inequality, and that means overconsumption of resources in the global north, and that means political and social exploitation of the global south. And I think that the racial and social inequality aspect, and the ways that the techno-optimists and all of those people you cited, starting with Bill Gates, intend to maintain the system of basically extraction from the global south for the benefit of corporations and much of the population of the global north, that is an argument that I think can help to open people's eyes, because I do think that the concept of racial and social inequality is one that most people in the United States understand and want to challenge, but often we tend to look at it in kind of narrow terms and not think about it in terms of planetary inequalities and who is actually doing the producing and consuming and benefiting from the producing and consuming, and who are the victims of the extravagant overuse of energy and all other resources that we enjoy in most of the global north. And even those of us who are struggling economically, which is a good proportion of the population of the United States, we're basically forced to overconsume by the way our society is structured and organized, by the debts we're forced to incur, by the lack of public options for things like transit and health that force us into the private sector, force us to collaborate in this system of global exploitation.
Yes, in fact, that's the next area I wanted to go to, was to look at the degrowth movement, because as you're talking about the need for us to not maintain the type of lifestyles that we have in this country, but we have to reduce our impact. And a lot of people, especially in kind of this individualistic society that we live in the US, are not amenable to that idea. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the degrowth movement, what its critique of the existing system of growth and inequality is. And you mentioned it's a proposal under construction for a completely different form of economic organization. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about what is the degrowth movement, and probably even more important, what is this proposal under construction for a completely different economic organization? How would it look?
Okay, thank you. So, the entire discipline of economics as it exists in this country is basically capitalist economics. That is, when we talk about like the laws of the economy or the need for economic growth, that is the laws, so-called laws of a particular economic system. It's not natural laws. Like if we talk about the law of gravity, that you can study by science, right? Like that actually exists. But the economy is a human creation, a human construction. So the laws of the economy are the laws created by people. They're not like natural laws that can't be changed. The laws of the economy can eminently be changed. So the basic premise of capitalist economics is that it must grow. And it must grow because the purpose of the economy is to create more and more stuff to do what we call improve what we call standard of living. So the myth that we're fed, which is, as with every myth, it has elements of truth, but it's only part of the truth, that this increases the standard of living so that all of us have access to more and more stuff, what you call lifestyle. So that is true, but it kind of hides the other purpose of the economy, which is to make more and more money for rich people, because the owners of the economy, the owners of corporations and businesses, especially under corporate capitalism, their goal is not only to enrich themselves individually, but they are legally required to prioritize the interests of their shareholders. So the purpose of money is to make more money. And the way you make more money is by getting more people to buy stuff, so that you can produce more. And we've come to associate economic growth with this idea of prosperity and living well and doing better. And we sort of think that, well, capitalism is how economies grow and everything gets better and better. That's, a really oversimplified view of capitalist economics. But when we look at how capitalism works in the global South, and even if we look more deeply at capitalism historically in the global North, we can also see that Marx was right in a lot of ways, that capitalism is about exploitation, the exploitation of nature and the exploitation of humans. and that there's an intimate relationship with the rise of capitalism and colonial expansion, enslavement, racism. All of those things have been built into the rise of capitalism and are still built into the way capitalism works, basically to extract resources and labor from the global south, whether it's what some call the global south in the global north, communities of color that are targeted for exploitation and marginalization. And I should say, what are called environmental justice communities that are also targeted for waste disposal and pollution. That's the global south in the global north, and the global south geographically speaking, which of course there's a global north in the global south as well. That is, there's a wealthy elite who profit from the system in the global south, as well as in the global north. So the degrowth movement challenges that whole concept that the goal of the economy is to grow, and says that the goal of the economy, that the goal of the economy should be to meet basic human needs in a just and equitable way. And so that we need to really, to completely rethink this idea of helping corporations to produce more so they can create more jobs, so that people can work more, so that people can buy more, and this kind of treadmill of overproduction, which invisibilizes the exploitation of workers, especially in the global south, and the exploitation of resources, the destruction of resources, the waste that is produced and consumed. Degrowth places at its center the fact that every form of production has environmental costs, and that we need to find a way globally to balance the environmental costs of what we produce with the human needs that need to be fulfilled. So the concept of planetary boundaries, which I mentioned before, looking at all these different areas in which our production and consumption and production of waste is exceeding the limits of the planet to sustain human life and other forms of life. We need to balance that with what's called the social floor. That's the environmental ceiling. Like, how much can we extract, process, produce, consume, and throw away? What's the environmental ceiling that we need to limit how much we extract, produce, consume, and throw away? But we also need to consider the social floor, that is, what are the basic human needs that we want our economy to fulfill? And again, the planetary boundaries school within degrowth, this is like one of the concepts that's used in the degrowth movement, has identified a number of social floors, things like food, housing, shelter, meaningful work, political voice, gender equity, education, energy, clean water, clean air. So like, what is the social foundation that everybody on the planet should have the right? Well, then the goal of the economy should be to figure out at a local level, but also on a global level, how can we fulfill humanity's basic needs without exceeding the ecological ceiling? How do we avoid falling under the social floor so that we really do orient our production and consumption, all of which has environmental costs, to fulfilling people's basic human needs? Yes. And human rights.
And that follows in, excuse me, you want to say something more?
So
because I do have a question.
So let me just say one more thing about degrowth. So this means that in the overgrown economies, like the ones that are vastly exceeding their share of the planetary boundaries in terms of their extraction, production, consumption, and creation of waste, their economies need to degrow, especially those sectors that do not meet basic human needs and that contribute way too much to exceeding the planetary boundaries. So that means a lot of luxury consumption. The private jets have to go. just as
Yacht.
one example. So degrowth doesn't mean that everything contracts. It means that excessive extraction, production, consumption, and creation of waste need to contract. But there are some things that even in rich countries need to grow, like access to healthcare, access to sufficient food. I mean, there's food security is a major problem in the United States, even though we produce way too much and we throw away way too much. So in the global South, there are entire economies that need to grow. That is, what needs to grow? The need for growth in certain sectors is much greater in the global South, and the need for shrinkage in certain sectors, degrowth per se, in many sectors is larger in the global North. But a key element of how we do this is also redistribution.
Very well put. Yes, I wanted to get to something before I open it up to audience questions. You mentioned in your book that Marxist scholars recently have highlighted capitalism exploitation of nature as well as of labor. And we read in our book club Kohei Saito's book, Marx and the Anthropocene, which goes into this in detail too, and goes into the notion of referencing Marx's recently translated letters and notebooks, where there's a connection, seems this is a very productive way of joining the environmental movement with the labor movement. Yet you also noted in your book that unions tend to be in bed with the capitalists. But as we know that in the early days of union organizing, this was not the case, as it was mostly socialists who were organizing unions. So do you see any hope today about the environmental movement and the labor movement joining forces in a way that would be strong enough to resist the agent provocateurs and the right-wing think tanks that are focused on destroying any such alliance?
So the labor movement has changed and evolved a lot over its history in the United States. If we want to go back to the 19th century, multiple roots in the 19th century and its evolution over the course of the 20th century. But the heyday of the labor movement is often seen as the mid 20th century, coming from the reforms of the New Deal, the World War II mobilization of labor and rights granted to labor, and the sort of and then the Cold War period, where granting further rights to labor and the sort of creation of this myth of the American middle class, and how like the elimination of the concept of the working class and turning unions into representatives of the middle class, workers struggled to gain human and civil rights in the United States and in the European countries and other like early industrializers, the sort of the proponents of capitalism around the world. So you were talking about the much more radical sectors of the labor movement. But since the 1970s, and labor made a bargain with capital, around the mid 20th century, that really strengthened the labor movement as a movement, but also implicated it in US Cold War politics, especially in terms of international relations, and in the capitalist system and in this concept of growth, and that that what's good for Ford is good for America because it creates jobs, and that workers are going to get paid enough to have their piece of the pie. In the highest strength of the American Union movement, approximately 35%, and this is in the mid 20th century, approximately 35% of the labor force is unionized. Today, that has shrunk dramatically, and there's been a lot of changes towards the end of the 20th century that have really depleted the power and density of the labor movement. And a lot of times we talk about these changes under the rubric of neoliberalism, which is both a domestic and a global set of policies that are basically about reducing the power of the bargaining power of the working class and increasing corporate profits. So one aspect of neoliberalism has been the destruction of leftist alternatives in, say, Latin America, which is the area that I've studied the most closely, but really everywhere in the global South. Um, the crushing of reformist governments that were trying to do some level of redistribution in their countries, starting perhaps in the 1950s in Guatemala, in the 1970s in Chile, in the 1980s in Central America, leading to, in the 1990s, especially after the collapse of the socialist bloc, the full implementation of neoliberalism under the aegis of international financial institutions. So that basically telling Latin American governments that you cannot prioritize the needs of your population. You must prioritize the repayment of your debts. And the way to do that is to invite foreign capital into your country. Now, at the same time, what does this mean for the United States and European countries? It means deindustrialization. It means the creation of the Rust Belt, as US industries are encouraged to take advantage of these highly repressive paradises for capital created by US foreign policy. So we see a capital flight. And this is one aspect of the attack on the working class in the United States, is deindustrialization. Another aspect is neoliberalism in the United States, Reaganomics, we tend to call it here, the idea of trickle-down economics, tax revolts, and the idea that promoting corporate America is the best way to raise the, this idea of the trickle down, that if we create benefits for corporations, and then we have this kind of race to the bottom, both inside the United States and outside the United States, where localities, states, countries are competing with each other to attract corporations because it's their only hope. But the way they attract corporations is by another pillar of neoliberalism, deregulation. So lower taxes, get rid of protections for labor, get rid of environmental protections. This is what's being imposed on the third world. And this is what is not being directly imposed, but imposed by, not by military coups, but by the force of this abstraction of the economy inside the United States as well. And there's a direct attack on the labor movement through legislation and through the composition of the National Labor Relations Board, so that it becomes much, much harder to unionize. And the threat of moving abroad is a part of the direct attack on labor, so that corporations say, well, if you try to form a union, we're just going to close down the factory and move it to Mexico, or move it to Central America, move it to the Dominican Republic. So by the end of the 20th century, rates of unionization have dropped dramatically, and especially in the private sector. So this means that, first of all, far fewer workers are unionized in the US today, which means that the labor movement as a whole has far less power. But it's also far disproportionately in the public sector. Now, the public sector has a different relationship to production and consumption, because workers in the public sector are not producing cars and drilling for oil. Workers in the public sector are mostly doing things like teaching. That is, they're actually in, not exclusively, but a far greater proportion are in the service sectors, the care sectors. And those are the sectors, even in the private sector, nurses, for example, are an area that remains strongly unionized. The care sectors of the economy, teaching, nursing, are actually the sectors that don't need to degrow. Those are sectors that need to grow. We have huge shortages of teachers and nurses. So attacks on the public sector have been another part of the neoliberal agenda. And in a way, the degrowth movement is an answer to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism took corporate capitalism to sort of its furthest right extreme, and degrowth is challenging the whole basis of that. Degrowth is about strengthening the sectors that provide human needs, and those, not purely coincidentally, they're not very profitable sectors. So nobody wants to invest in them because you're not going to make a lot of money in supporting them. But they are and they're also not very environmentally destructive. Like having more teachers in the classroom doesn't cause the same kind of environmental destruction as building more weapons does. So, I think that the labor, if you look at which sectors of the labor movement have been involved in areas like the Labor Network for Sustainability, and questioning the productivist and growth-oriented ideology of the techno-optimist solution, and being willing to recognize the destructive environmental effects of extraction, production, consumption, and waste. Those are right now some of the strongest sectors in the labor movement. So those are unions that are very much more ideologically open to understanding the kinds of economic transformations that could really help bring about a reduction in emissions.
Right.
I think the idea that switching to electric SUVs and pouring huge amounts of public funds into automobile companies to create more jobs, building electric vehicles, which have extremely deleterious environmental effects, despite the fact that they produce less in terms of CO2 emissions. I think a degrowth approach to transportation places much more emphasis on public transportation, yes, electrified, but some kind of low-use sharing model for private vehicles, which will no longer be private vehicles, but will be socialized in some way to greatly reduce the amount of production of cars and the amount of cars. But we also have to emphasize that meeting basic human needs is at the center of this. And if we had a public commitment to the meeting of basic human needs, the idea of working less hours, if you knew that your children's education was going to be covered, that your healthcare was going to be covered, that your retirement was going to be covered, like a lot of the things that unions have fought for don't have to be guaranteed by the job. They could be guaranteed by dramatic changes in public policy. And that would enable many sectors of the working class to think beyond the only way to meet basic human needs is through my employer.
Yes, like some of the countries in Europe and like the Mondragon cooperatives, which I often talk about in that region, have a different, they would say people before profit, and that's always the motto. That's a much longer discussion, but I want to open it up now to other people's questions. I have many more I could ask you. I could talk to you all afternoon, Avi. I mean, about war and the whole emissions due to war and due to the preparations of war and the banking systems, but we don't have time for all that. So I'm going to go to Jerry. He has his hand up. Do you want to unmute?
Hi, thank you so much, Aviva. I am an environmental lawyer, and I'm a member of the Sierra Club State Committee on Climate and Energy, and your book is my Bible.
Oh, thank you.
Has been for years. And but what I find is that it's really challenging to get people to buy into the concept of degrowth. And this is true, of very committed people in this Sierra Club committee that I'm a member of. It's a large group of people, a lot of people with strong technical backgrounds. But I think for two reasons. One, that they've really internalized the capitalist model of perpetual growth, and the other is that they're concerned that if they come out publicly to embrace degrowth, it'll limit their ability to influence people in power. So my question to you is, to what extent have you encountered those same challenges? And what's your sense of how to deal with them?
Well, I think that degrowth is easy to caricature. And some degrowth activists even suggest that we change the terminology because it is so easy to caricature. But, you know, it requires more than a soundbite. But I find when I talk about degrowth with my students, if we have a few weeks to lead up to it, to talk about, you know, especially in my class, it's not even a class on environmentalism. I mean, all of our students know, the younger generation knows that there's an environmental crisis. In my course on colonialism and the making of the modern world, we talk a lot about the colonial background to the world we live in today, and also the colonial nature of the world that we live in today. And when we get to degrowth at the end of the class, they all say, well, that's so obvious. Like, why are we even wasting time talking about it? Like, obviously, degrowth is the only solution. But it does require more than a soundbite. And I do think that the terminology of donut economics, which is basically the popular way of looking at what I was talking about, the planetary boundaries, you know, the social floor and the environmental ceiling. So the donut is the space between the social floor and the environmental ceiling, where the goal of the economy should be to get all of us locally and globally into that donut where we don't exceed planetary boundaries and we don't fall below the social floor. It will always be easy, I think, for the right wing to say, you know, they're trying to take away our hamburgers or they're trying to take away our SUVs. But I think the emphasis should be on, like, the vast majority of people in the United States feel overstressed and like we are missing something. And understanding that the way we live is not the only way to live, and this constant treadmill of production and consumption, I think that's actually an attractive idea to most people. And, you know, I teach in a regional state university, so I'm not just talking about elites. A lot of our students are first generation, they're immigrants, and they are just overwhelmed with debt, overwhelmed with work, overwhelmed with family responsibilities, incredibly stressed. They don't feel like they're living the dream. So I think being able to understand that the way our economy and society are organized is not the only way it could be organized. I think people are open to that if you have some time to talk to them about it.
Thank you for that, because I think a lot of times we feel pressured to have soundbite answers, and they're not appropriate for the kinds of concepts and ideas that we're talking about today. Bob, you have your hand up next.
Yeah, please. Thanks. I was really struck by your mention of this idea of the environmental ceiling and the social floor. And what struck me was that if you can really start quantifying those parameters, defining them, you should be able to model what is in between. And I'm wondering, has anything been modeled? You know, are there models like that tell us not only at the United States level, but really more importantly at the global level, what we would have to do? Because right now, You're also right that sound bites are not going to work. So there has to be something compelling. And I think that's what's missing right now is something that's compelling. Technology is not going to get us there either. It may do some mitigation, but we have no argument, really, a compelling argument for adjusting our way of life that is going to give us any more assurance that we can get there. So I'll go back to my question. Do you know of any modeling that says what? Because this is bigger than the United States problem. You've got populations. I mean, you think that Americans are overtaxed and worried. How about Ethiopians? Okay, they don't have anything, or Somalians. has a massive number of people that not only are in dire straits and need growth, but they don't even have the resources anywhere near them to.
Let's go back to the question, Bob.
Yeah. All right. I'll get off. I will.
No, I just wanted you to focus on the question so that we would.
Yeah, so I would look at, and I can't tell you the URL off the top of my head, but maybe if you can Google it, you can find it, Georgia. A Good Life for All Within Planetary Boundaries. It's something like planetaryboundaries.org, but it's not that. It's I can't remember exactly what it is, but anyone can look for it. If you just search for A Good Life for All Within Planetary Boundaries. They've done a lot of modeling, both at the global level of the kinds of pressure we're putting on different kinds of planetary boundaries, and how at a planetary level we're doing with meeting the social floor, the social foundation. And they've also done really detailed country by country analyses. So you can see how much we're failing at a planetary level, and you can also look at which countries are greatly exceeding their share of the planetary boundaries and which countries are falling far below the social floors. And there are very few, if any, countries that succeed in meeting the social floors without exceeding the planetary boundaries. There's some that come a lot closer than many who like far exceed or far fall below. So I think that kind of modeling is really useful. But I also think that we need to think about not only how our domestic economic systems work to perpetuate the system, but how our global economic systems work to perpetuate the system, and our global institutions work to perpetuate the system. So that's one thing that I feel like the modeling itself doesn't specifically get at, like how do international financial institutions perpetuate this? I really recommend also the work of Jason Hickel, Hickel, who's done a lot to look at these global inequalities and the colonial nature of contemporary economies. So he has a couple of books and a lot of articles that have also used this planetary boundaries framework.
Right. I'm going to go to Linda and Rocky next. Linda, are you ready?
Yeah, I had to take myself off mute. Thanks. You know, Ava, I agree with everything you're saying. Absolutely, degrowth. I know there's models out there. I know there are countries that are doing much better job than we are. Some of the Finlandian, Netherlands countries, and of course there's Mondragon, which really require very different sets of values that people have, a different history, a different. But I guess my main question is this: since we are in the United States, I don't see politically, since Citizens United, how we're going to get there in terms of policy shifts. So I'm wondering, given what you know about how we have created the system in the US that we have, given that we have unlimited numbers or amounts of money being spent by very few politicians, and yet they dominate the press and they dominate really everything. Where do you see the cracks? I mean, where do you see the openings that might help us shift to more of a degrowth economy? How do you see it happening? I mean, from a policy point of view.
I mean, I think that in this area, as in pretty much every area, to bring about change, you have to think about inside, outside strategies. That is, you have to both work inside the system and from the outside to put pressure on the system. So inside the system, I mean, working, getting people elected, working in Congress. But like once somebody's elected, there has to be constant pressure on them from kind of outside the system, because there's going to be plenty of pressure on them from inside the system. So, a radical candidate can only do as much as popular backing is going to be constantly pushing them to do, especially because they know they're going to have a lot of pushback that's going to prevent them from getting elected again if unless there's a popular movement strong enough to sustain them. I'm just thinking about, like, our political system doesn't really respond. It manipulates public opinion, but it doesn't really respond to public opinion. And, we were just talking about this last night in an event we did on campus on Gaza, and how, we're out there protesting every week. People are protesting all over the country. Public opinion polls show that everybody wants Biden to stop this slaughter that's going on. But Biden is not moving. He's making a few little comments like to try to placate people, but he is not moving at the same time that he's saying, oh yeah, we want Israel to stop, but let's send them more F-16s. So it's really discouraging to realize that our political system doesn't respond to popular opinion. And, in meeting with this same military congressional representative I was telling you about earlier, his chief of staff actually said to us, Seth doesn't care about public opinion. He doesn't think that it's his job to listen to his constituents. He thinks he was elected to lead. So now he's been elected, you just have to let him make his decisions. So yeah, there's a lot of forces stacked against us. And I feel like but there's also a lot of popular discontent. And I think that, I don't think that there's one solution that needs to be taken. I think it's all hands on deck. All solutions need to be taken in this case of climate and other emergencies that are facing us right now. So there needs to be a lot more education. There needs to be a lot more creation of avenues for people to get involved. There needs to be a lot more election of progressives into Congress. There needs to be a reform of the political system and get rid of the electoral college. Like, we need to do all of these things, and they're not contradictory to each other. But, it's also just really interesting for me to compare the time I spent in Colombia, where I worked a lot with communities affected by coal mining, multinational strip mines that are displacing very energy poor Afro-descended and indigenous rural populations that are definitely the people who are falling under the social floor and are not exceeding their planetary boundaries in order for multinational corporations to export coal to the United States and Europe, so that we can exceed our planetary boundaries even further. The population there is so mobilized, and people there just feel like they have no choice. They have to be out in the streets every single day. They're so organized. And, sometimes it's surprising to me how politically disempowered people in the US feel. And of course, there are a lot of reasons why we feel politically disempowered. And even those of us who are activists feel politically disempowered. But what's striking is how empowered some of the most powerless people on the planet feel. Like, they don't have the luxury of feeling disempowered. They just have to keep doing it. So I think that's part of what we have to learn from the populations that are suffering the most in the global South right now. That we can't let our discouragement and feelings of political disempowerment prevent us from doing all of the things that we need to do and that we know we need to do.
I like that comment, that we have the luxury of feeling disempowered and we need to get off of that. I think we'll take a last question from Joel. Joel, if you can unmute.
Okay. Hi. I guess, as I've got like two things I just want to talk about real briefly, but as I go through my list of what are the causes of the causes here in our system, what I end up with was ultimately we have to have public funding of elections.
Mm-hmm.
And The other thing is, I think we're all old enough to remember the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s. And, I haven't spent a ton of time or effort thinking about how that kind of just fizzled. So those are the two topics. I was just curious if you'd be interested in talking about those.
I'm sorry, I've been on high gear for so long this afternoon because I just taught 2 classes right before this. What was your first question? I got the second one. I didn't write down the first one. So can you just repeat the first thought?
I think it was the political need for public
Public-
finance.
Oh, public funding of elections.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. First one, yeah, I absolutely completely agree with that. There's a lot that needs to be reformed in our electoral system. We need to get rid of the electoral college. We need to have ranked choice voting. We need to have publicly funded elections. And that is definitely a really important part of the struggle to democratize the United States. And democratizing the United States is an important piece of trying to create a more just world, since the United States plays a really big role in the world. In terms of the environmental movement fizzling, I'm not sure I completely agree that it's fizzled. I think that, the previous speaker just talked about the Sierra Club. That's an environmental organization that's been around for many, many decades, and has actually, I would say, in many ways, radicalized and strengthened in the last couple of decades. That is, it's, the US environmental movement has multiple roots, but one strand, which is definitely part of the history of the Sierra Club, is this idea of preserving the wilderness for rich white people to enjoy. And if you look at what's happened to the Sierra Club over the past couple of decades, and other major environmental organizations that have been around for a long time, they've really been taking strong action to question some of their own deep premises and think about environmentalism in more socially just ways, more human-centered ways, more human rights-centered ways, less racist ways. So, certainly there have been attempts at corporate takeover of the environmental movement, and some sectors of the environmental movement have bought into that. And some sectors, some organizations, I think, really have tried to play the inside-outside game. So trying to be inside institutions of power to change them from within, but at the same time continue to work outside them to pressure them. In many ways, I think we can say that the environmental movement, as it was conceived in the late 20th century, has been enormously successful in the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, a lot of really important environmental legislation, but I think both our impact on the environment and our understanding of our impact have increased and changed. And we've been slow to kind of lumbering in our responses. But I think the environmental consciousness of the younger generation is in many ways shaped by the history of the multiple environmental movements, like the environmental justice movement that just emerged in the late 20th century. So yeah, I wouldn't say fizzled is the right word.
I agree. I've seen a lot of improvements and actually a deepening and understanding of the environmental movement that didn't probably exist in 1970 or even in the 70s. So I want to thank you so much, Aviva, for being with us today. This has been really a rich discussion and loved hearing your thoughts. And I want to recommend the book again, Is Science Enough? As Jerry Bernhardt said, this is his Bible. It's an excellent book for understanding what needs to change in order to have climate solutions. So thank you so much. And I will be sending all of you, and those of you who even didn't get on for the live program, you will get a link to this program this evening. Any
Thank you
last
so
word?
much.
Any last thought, Aviva, or, okay?
No, just thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you again. Stop recording.